The Legislature. The three arms of government are the Legislature, the Executive, and the Judiciary. The Legislature is the arm of government that makes the law. In Australia, the Legislature takes the form of the Federal Parliament and the various state and territory parliaments. Parliaments in Australia and around the world usually follow the same form. This is based upon the British Parliament, which consists of two houses and the monarch's representative. In Britain, the two houses are the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The monarch is, of course, the Queen. In order to create a new law, a proposed law has to be voted upon and passed by both houses of the British Parliament and then approved by the Queen. The Federal Parliament also consists of two houses, although they do have different names. The lower house of the Federal Parliament is called the House of Representatives, and the upper house of the Federal Parliament is called the Senate. The monarch is, of course, represented by the Governor-General. In order for the Federal Parliament to make a new law, the proposed law has to be voted upon and passed by the lower house and the upper house and approved by the Governor-General. The various state parliaments around Australia typically have two houses. The lower house in the state parliaments is usually, but not always, called the Legislative Assembly. The upper house is usually, but not always, called the Legislative Council, and the monarch is represented in each state by the governor. In order for a state parliament to make a new law, the proposed law has to be voted upon and passed by both houses of the state parliament and approved by the governor. The only state in Australia that does not have two houses is Queensland. In the 1920s, the Queensland Upper House voted itself out of existence. Today in Queensland, the Parliament consists of a single house, the Legislative Assembly. This means that it is easier for the government of the day to pass legislation and, of course, much quicker. Let's look more closely at the lower house, focusing upon the Federal Parliament in Australia. The lower house of the Federal Parliament is known as the House of Representatives. It's also known as the People's House because the intent of the Federal Parliament's lower house is to ensure equal representation by all Australian voters. Australia is divided up into 150 electorates. Each electorate contains about the same number of people. This means that the various electorates in geographical terms are of varying in sizes depending upon the population density. Looking at this map here, you can see that the electorates down the east coast of Australia are geographically quite small because the population density around the capital cities is of course much higher. In the areas where there are fewer people, the electorates are, in geographical terms, much larger. Each of the electorates on this map contain about the same number of people. Each electorate gets to send one person to represent them in the lower house of the Federal Parliament. Most representatives are members of political parties, and the political party that has the most representatives in the lower house is said to have won the election, because they will determine which members of the lower and upper houses will be selected to act as members of the executive government and to assume roles as ministers. The upper house of the Federal Parliament is called the Senate. It's known as the States House. Unlike the lower house, where the number of people from each state depends upon the population of the state, in the upper house, each of the states has equal representation. Each state gets to send 12 people to sit in the upper house. This means that, for example, New South Wales, which has the largest population in Australia, sends 12 senators to sit in the Senate, and Tasmania, which has the smallest population, also gets to send 12 senators. This ensures that in the upper house at least, each of the states has an equal voice. The territories are represented by 2 senators each. This means that the number of senators in the upper house of the federal parliament is 12 times 6 plus 2 times 2, which is 76. At 76, this means that the Senate is about half as large as the House of Representatives, which has 150 representatives. In order for the federal parliament to make a new law, the new law will begin as a proposal, and as we saw in topic 1, these proposals for new laws can come from a variety of sources. It can come from the executive government itself, which has a new policy that it wants to see implemented, or it could come from the community, where perhaps a lobby group has persuaded the government of the day to make a change to the law. The new proposal has to be drafted into the form of a bill or draft legislation. This is usually done by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, which is a group of lawyers. Most bills are first introduced into the lower house, although it is not always the case that a bill will start in the lower house. Whichever house the bill begins in, the various members of that house will debate the bill and then take a vote. And if the majority of members of that house vote in favour of the passage of the bill, it is said to have passed through that house. It will then move on to the other house, usually the upper house if the bill has begun in the lower house, and again it will go through a process of debate, discussion, and eventually a vote. And if a majority of members of the upper house vote in favour of the bill, then it will have been passed by the upper house. Before the bill can become law, it has to receive the approval of the Governor-General in the federal parliament or the governor in the various state parliaments. And then once it's received this approval, which is often known as assent or royal assent, the legislation will then come into effect. What happens if a bill is passed by one House of Parliament but is rejected by the other House? This eventuality is addressed in Section 57 of the Australian Constitution, which provides that if the upper house fails to pass a bill that has been passed by the lower house, and after 3 months the bill is once again passed by the lower house and rejected by the upper house, the Governor-General is entitled to declare a double dissolution. This effectively means that the members of both houses of Parliament are dismissed and an election will have to be held in order to create a new upper and lower house. If the new legislation is again passed by the lower house and rejected by the upper house, the Governor-General under the Constitution can combine the two houses in a single sitting where the legislation will be voted upon once and for all. And since the lower house is twice the size of the upper house, as we saw earlier, it is likely that the legislation will be passed at that stage.